The Russian president declared the war on the record. Should I play the video of your president?
Россия дала упреждающий отпор агрессии. Это было вынужденное, своевременное и единственно правильное решение.
Наші люди, наші українці не відступають, не здаються, не зупиняють свого спротиву.
He expected our support for Ukraine to crumble with time. He was wrong. He was wrong.
We will continue to provide our full support. Now, to sustain your people through this atrocious war and for the future.
Just before 5 a.m. on February 24th, Russian President Vladimir Putin makes an unscheduled television address, announcing he had decided to conduct what he says is a special military operation. Putin claims rebel-held territories in Luhansk and Donetsk had asked for Moscow's help.
И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины, а также преданию суду тех, кто совершил многочисленные кровавые преступления против мирных жителей, в том числе и граждан Российской Федерации.
Soon after, missiles and airstrikes hit cities across Ukraine, while Russian tanks and troops crossed the borders into Ukraine. At dawn, air raid sirens sound over the Ukrainian capital. At the request of Kyiv, the United Nations Security Council schedules an emergency session where Russia holds the rotating presidency.
You declared the war. It is the responsibility of this body to stop the war. So I call on every one of you to do everything possible to stop the war.
But by then, Russia has already launched an all-out invasion, attacking Ukraine by land, air, and sea. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky declares martial law and orders a full military mobilization. Many experts expect Kyiv to fall swiftly, but the Ukrainian military resistance proves much stronger. Zelensky also surprises the world with his resilience and by refuting claims that he had fled the capital.
Президент тут, всі ми тут, наші військові тут, громадяни суспільства тут, всі ми тут. Захищаємо нашу незалежність, нашу державу. І так буде і далі. Слава нашим захисникам, слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні! Слава!
Western leaders respond to Russia's invasion by imposing economic sanctions against Moscow. Historically, Russia has supplied about 40% of Europe's gas, but Washington steps in to cut reliance on Russian gas imports.
America will lead that effort, releasing 30 million barrels of our own strategic petroleum reserve. And we stand ready to do more if necessary, united with our allies.
In the ensuing months, the sanctions expand to phasing out all Russian oil imports. Russian firms are barred from key technology. The assets of Russian oligarchs and officials and foreign currency reserves of Russia's central bank are frozen, and major Russian banks are banned from the global transaction network SWIFT. 7 days after the invasion, the United Nations General Assembly gathers, where 141 members vote in favor of denouncing Putin's attack. China is among 35 that abstain from the vote. That same day, Russian forces capture Kherson. The southern port city becomes the first to fall under Russian control. Kyiv had repeatedly urged NATO to impose a no-fly zone to prevent Russia from gaining control of the skies over Ukraine, but the transatlantic military alliance rejects the request.
Our assessment is that we understand the desperation, but we also believe that if we did that, we'll end up with something that could end in a full-fledged war in Europe, involving many more countries.
Throughout the month of March, Russian forces launch aggressive attacks in Kherson and Mariupol. More than 3,000 civilians are killed in March 2022, a number far greater than any other month of the war. But Moscow fails to take Kyiv. As Russian forces pull back from areas around the capital, evidence of war atrocities emerges in the nearby city of Bucha.
Військові злочини, і це буде визнано світом як геноцид. Те, що ви сьогодні тут знаходитесь і бачите, що відбулося, ми знаємо тисячі людей вбитих і закатованих з відрубаними кінцівками, зґвалтовані жінки, вбиті діти.
Russia denies the war crime allegations, saying the images are yet another provocation by Ukraine. In the port city of Mariupol, weeks of fighting come to an end when the last Ukrainian fighters surrender to Russian forces. The complete capture of the Azovstal steel plant is Moscow's biggest victory of the war yet. After its February invasion, Russia blocks Ukraine from exporting grain shipments from its Black Sea ports, sending food prices soaring around the world, particularly in developing countries. But on July 22nd, Moscow and Kyiv sign a landmark deal allowing Ukrainian grain to be exported across the Black Sea, which brings some reprieve. Since the war began, an estimated 1,000 global brands had suspended operations in Russia by August 17th. Their exit paves the way for knockoff products to fill store shelves in Russia. Ukraine launches a counter-offensive in Kherson in September. As Moscow relocates troops to the south, Ukrainians take advantage of the situation by retaking Kharkiv in the northeast.
Честь подякувати всім вам за те, що ви звільняєте нашу державу від ворога, від терористів Російської Федерації.
Over 6 months into its invasion, Russia shows the first signs of being short on troops. Putin orders a partial mobilization of 300,000 soldiers to fight in Ukraine. Thousands of Russians flee to neighboring countries to avoid the military draft. According to the UN, Russian authorities arrest more than 2,000 people who protested against the mobilization order. Mercenaries from a Russian private military company are also deployed to the front lines, mostly in the eastern city of Bakhmut. The Wagner Group is run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a close ally of Putin. Prigozhin reportedly recruits soldiers from Russian prisons, offering them pardons if they enlist. Russia announces the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, a move which the UN General Assembly condemns as illegal. Referendums held by Moscow-appointed officials claim that voters in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson approved of joining Russia. Ukraine and the West dismissed the poll as a sham, and Kyiv quickly announces a fast-tracked bid to join the NATO military alliance. The longest bridge in Europe explodes on October 8th. Moscow blames Kyiv for the attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge. The roadway had served as a major supply route for Russian forces in southern Ukraine. The 12-mile bridge was also Moscow's only direct road to Crimea, which it had annexed in 2014. Putin himself had inaugurated the $3.7 billion project in 2018, and the Russian state media had hailed it as the construction of the century. Russian forces retreat from Kherson. The city was the only regional capital Moscow had captured since the war began. Kyiv's retaking of the city is seen as one of Moscow's biggest losses of the war so far.
8 місяців іздівательств. Ні, цих води кормили. Це було щось страшне. Ждали, дуже ждали. Ми вірили, ми надіялися на все. Слава Україні!
As Moscow's battlefield losses mount, Russian forces begin targeting Ukraine's power grid as winter nears.
He has decided that if he can't seize Ukraine by force, he will try to freeze the country into submission.
Zelensky heads to the US for his first trip outside Ukraine since the start of the war.
Against all odds and doom and gloom scenarios, Ukraine didn't fall. Ukraine is alive and kicking.
US President Joe Biden announces more military aid for Kyiv, including the Patriot surface-to-air missile system. But the US and Germany have long resisted internal and external pressure to provide Ukrainian soldiers with sophisticated tanks. Washington cites challenges with training and maintenance, while Berlin says it would not go it alone and points to the risks of drawing NATO into a broader conflict with Moscow. Then, on January 25th, Germany finally agrees to send its Leopard 2 tanks. It is quickly followed by the US announcing it would send its M1 Abrams tanks.
Und deshalb müssen wir bei allem, was wir tun, immer ganz klarstellen, dass wir das Notwendige und das Mögliche machen, um die Ukraine zu unterstützen, dass wir aber gleichzeitig eine Eskalation des Krieges zu einem Krieg zwischen Russland und der NATO verhindern. Und dieses Prinzip werden wir auch weiterhin immer beachten.
The West sending its best tanks may provide Ukraine with the offensive power needed to retake territory. But air power remains a missing element in Ukraine's offensive operations. During his European tour, Zelensky appeals to Western leaders for more weaponry, including fighter jets. Zelensky also urges the European Union to accelerate the delivery of modern long-range weapons and reiterates hopes for Ukraine to quickly join the bloc.
Європа, ми захищаємось від найбільш антиєвропейської сили сучасного світу. Ми захищаємось, ми, українці, на полі бою разом з вами.
There are also concerns that Ukraine is using up ammunition faster than Western suppliers can keep up with. The EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, is among several who call on Western leaders to speed up production and delivery of munitions for Kyiv. Joe Biden secretly travels to Kyiv, becoming the first modern US president to go to an active war zone where the US military does not control critical infrastructure. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Washington notified Moscow about the trip some hours before Biden's departure for deconfliction purposes between the two nuclear-armed countries. But Biden's risky trip is a clear signal to Russia that the US remains committed to helping Ukraine.
1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you.
As of February 20th, the US has promised a total of $24.9 billion in military aid for Ukraine since the war began. The US aid to Ukraine far exceeds what any other country has provided to Kyiv. As the war's one-year anniversary approaches, Kyiv says Russia is preparing for a maximum escalation in eastern Ukraine. Both countries have claimed that they are willing to negotiate to end the war. Ukraine has proposed a peace summit by the end of February 2023, but said Russia could participate only if it first faces a tribunal for its war crimes. Russia says Ukraine must accept all of its demands, including that the country surrenders the regions that Moscow claims to have annexed. With both sides issuing demands that are unacceptable to the other, there appears to be little hope for serious negotiations in the near future. Meanwhile, the number of dead and injured continues to rise. Moscow has said 5,937 Russian troops have been killed as of September 2022. Kyiv has previously said 9,000 Ukrainian troops had died as of August 2022, but other estimates show the death tolls are in the tens of thousands. By the end of January 2023, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights estimates a total of 18,000 civilian casualties, with 7,000 killed and 11,000 injured. The UN also says the war has sparked Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. Millions of Ukrainians, mostly women and children, have fled the country as men have been ordered to stay and fight. Military analysts say the conflict has now evolved into a war of attrition, as both sides try to defeat the other by inflicting losses in personnel, equipment, and morale.